The investor demo was scheduled for Friday morning, and everyone treated it like a finish line. Calendars were blocked, executives were attentive, and small mistakes suddenly carried large consequences. In environments like this, pressure does not announce itself loudly. It tightens quietly, forcing people to reveal habits they usually hide when the stakes are lower. When the team lead launched the prototype, recognition hit immediately. The navigation felt familiar. The architecture followed decisions you had debated for months. Even the shortcuts reflected compromises made under deadline stress. This was not coincidence or influence. It was direct extraction, cleaned of attribution and presented as collective effort. Your name was missing from the screen. The comments that once explained intent had been stripped away. What remained was the logic, intact and confident, now wearing someone else's voice. He spoke smoothly, using your language, but without the weight of understanding. To experienced ears, confidence without ownership has a hollow sound. You did nothing. No interruption. No correction. Silence was not hesitation, but assessment. In that moment, something more important than theft became clear. He believed the room belonged to him. He believed access meant authority. And he believed no one present had the standing or the patience to challenge what he had taken. Experience teaches restraint. You let the moment pass because moments have consequences when handled correctly. The demo continued, the audience watched, and the assumption of ownership settled into the room. You understood that once a false claim is accepted publicly, it also becomes measurable, traceable, and eventually correctable. Time would do the rest without emotion or unnecessary confrontation. Later, quietly with time, you learn that professional theft rarely arrives with noise. It settles quietly into the rhythm of a project, disguised as teamwork or framed as shared progress. Urgency becomes the shield people use when they hope no one will examine the details. Collaboration becomes the word they repeat when they want to avoid explaining the origin of an idea. You have seen this pattern before, and the signs rarely change. The first clue appeared in the repository. Commits that should have been visible simply were not there. Pieces of logic had been copied into branches where they did not belong. The timestamps carried a strange stiffness, as if they had been rewritten to disguise gaps in the workflow. These are not dramatic discoveries. They are small fractures, the kind that experienced professionals notice long before others understand their significance. The second clue came from his explanations. He presented the prototype confidently, but when investors asked about the deeper mechanics, his rhythm faltered. He offered broad statements where specifics were expected and used repetition to hide the absence of understanding. Surface knowledge moved easily for him, but depth forced hesitation. That hesitation is unmistakable to someone who has lived through deadlines, failures, rebuilds, and the long path of learning that real ownership demands. You did not request clarification. You did not confront him. Confrontation is a tool, not a reflex, and experienced people use it sparingly. What mattered most was not evidence, but timing. The structure of the moment was already shifting, and the room had begun to sense an imbalance. Sometimes the most powerful position is to wait and allow the truth to reveal itself through the questions others will eventually ask. Silence is a tool that most people underestimate. Early in your career, you believe you must defend every idea immediately. Over time, you learn that timing shapes truth more than volume ever will. When you recognized your work being presented without credit, instinct would have pushed a younger version of you to speak. Age refined that impulse. You understood that calling out theft in the opening moments would only turn the situation emotional, and emotion weakens clarity in a professional arena. You allowed the demo to continue because you needed the story to settle into the room. The investors had to hear his version first. They needed to believe his confidence long enough for the contrast to reveal itself naturally. Once the prototype was shown and his explanations became part of the official presentation, responsibility attached itself to him. That attachment mattered more than any accusation you could make. By letting the presentation stand, you ensured that ownership was publicly implied. The moment he claimed authorship through performance, he established a trail of accountability he could not reverse. This is something experience teaches quietly. A false claim is strongest in the moment it is spoken, and weakest once others begin to examine it. You said nothing because restraint protects the truth better than confrontation. You said nothing because the room needed to see the cracks without your guidance. You said nothing because you understood the value of structure. Once a claim becomes official, it can also be dismantled cleanly. Your silence was not hesitation. It was preparation. The atmosphere in the investor room carried a focused stillness. Everyone sat with the posture of people who understood the cost of a mistake. The presentation had moved smoothly until the questions began to shift from general interest to technical depth. This shift is where real evaluations happen. Polite curiosity becomes scrutiny, and scrutiny reveals what preparation usually tries to hide. The first investor asked about scalability. The team lead answered quickly, offering a polished summary that sounded memorized rather than lived. Another investor followed with a question about system security. His reply landed with less confidence. When a third investor asked how the platform would behave under failover conditions, a pause slipped into the space between the words. The pause lasted long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Improvisation replaced certainty. His hands moved more than his thoughts. He circled back to phrases he had already used, hoping repetition would fill the gaps. Experienced professionals know that repetition is the clearest signal of lost footing. The investors exchanged short glances, not dramatic, just subtle signs that the conversation had shifted. You remained silent, watching the dynamic unfold. Silence carries weight when people expect expertise. As the questions grew more specific, the room began searching for someone who understood the architecture beyond presentation slides. Their attention turned toward you slowly, almost naturally, as if the space between answers was pointing in your direction. In that room, pressure did not explode. It tightened. Confidence slipped from performance into discomfort. And in that tightening, the balance of authority moved toward the person who understood the system rather than the person who performed it. Eyes shifted toward you, because truth has a way of guiding its own direction. The room settled into a quiet tension when the investors realized the conversation was drifting away from clarity. One of them, a senior member who rarely spoke unless necessary, placed his tablet on the table and addressed the group with calm certainty. He introduced you without ceremony, presenting your name and your new position as the Chief Technology Officer. The announcement did not need emphasis. Its simplicity carried more weight than any display of authority. The impact was immediate. The atmosphere shifted, as if an unseen door had closed. The executives straightened, the investors refocused, and the team lead froze for a fraction of a second. He had prepared for questions. He had not prepared for the revelation that the person he believed to outrank in silence had already been elevated by the investment group. Authority does not shout. It enters a room with alignment behind it. In that moment, the structure of the meeting changed direction. The team lead no longer stood as the primary voice. His confidence thinned, not because of emotion, but because hierarchy had been clarified in a legal and strategic sense. The prototype he claimed to understand now belonged to the responsibility of the individual newly introduced. You observed quietly, allowing the room to absorb the recalibration. The investors turned toward you with questions shaped not by curiosity, but by expectation. The team lead felt the shift without needing anyone to explain it. His certainty dissolved into awareness. The presentation he believed he controlled no longer belonged to him. Authority had entered the room, and with it came accountability he had not anticipated. The power had moved, not with noise, but with structure. The transition of attention settled on you naturally. You did not raise your voice or change your posture. You simply waited until the room finished adjusting to the new hierarchy. Once the investors had directed their focus toward you, the moment arrived with clarity. You asked a single question. It was not emotional, not confrontational, and not designed to embarrass anyone. It was the kind of question that exists at the center of every technical decision. You asked who authorized the use of this derivative code. The simplicity of the question made it impossible to deflect. It required no analysis. It required no speculation. It required only ownership, one of the few responsibilities that cannot be borrowed or improvised. The team lead opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come. He looked toward the slides for help, then toward the investors, then toward the floor. Each glance deepened the silence. You did not follow the question with another. Professionals over 50 understand the value of absence. A quiet room can reveal more truth than a heated argument. Documentation was already on your side. Repository logs, access histories, and project records carried more authority than any defense he could attempt. All you needed was the moment where he acknowledged, through silence, that he had no authorization to claim. The investors exchanged slow, deliberate looks. They recognized what the pause meant. The team lead finally lowered his gaze, not in apology, but in realization. The narrative he had built could not withstand a single request for clarity. The meeting did not need further confrontation. The question had already done the work. Silence completed it. Once the demo concluded, the tone of the day changed. The energy that usually follows a successful presentation never appeared. People moved with quiet purpose, avoiding unnecessary conversation. The investors met privately with the executive team, and within an hour an internal review was initiated. Access rights were examined first. Accounts were paused, then restored selectively, creating a pattern that revealed where attention was being directed. Code audits began next. Entire sections of the repository were traced line by line. The history of changes that once seemed ordinary now appeared irregular. Files that should have shown weeks of development displayed only hours of activity. Reviewers made notes, conferred in pairs, and returned with questions that grew more precise with every pass. These were not emotional reactions. They were procedural steps designed to establish clarity. The team lead submitted explanations through official channels. Each message arrived with a tone of urgency, but lacked the substance needed to satisfy the investigation. His statements referenced collaboration and shared responsibility, yet the records told a different story. The more he tried to frame the narrative, the more the documentation narrowed the path he could take. You did not participate in the chaos. Your role required steady oversight, not reaction. You answered questions only when asked and allowed the system to function as intended. Professionals who have lived through organizational conflict understand that true correction does not come from confrontation. It comes from alignment. No one celebrated what happened. There was nothing to celebrate. The company simply adjusted its structure to reflect reality, and in that adjustment, the consequences settled naturally. If you are over 50, you already understand the quiet strength that comes with experience. The world often rewards noise, but noise rarely survives the moment when accountability enters the room. Real value is not displayed. It is demonstrated through decisions, consistency, and structure. You do not need to rush to prove anything. Time has already done part of the work for you. Experience does not compete with volume. It positions itself where clarity matters most. This is why emotional reactions feel unnecessary at this stage of life. You have learned that responding too quickly gives power to the wrong moment. Responding with structure anchors the truth in a place no one can distort. When someone undermines your work, the worst mistake you can make is to argue with them emotionally. Let documentation reveal what words try to hide. Professionals who draw confidence from visibility often forget that visibility fades. Structures remain. Records remain. Systems remember the details people try to bury. The individuals who claim ownership without understanding eventually find themselves in conflict with the very proof they ignored. You do not need to correct them loudly. You need only let the process unfold. Hold your ground with calm authority. Trust your preparation. Trust your history. Trust the discipline you have earned through years of building, repairing, and rebuilding. People who confuse presence with ownership always meet the moment when the record speaks louder than their performance. Let that truth work for you. Experience is not an argument. It is a conclusion.